Rob Sheridan, who is launching a new book at Vertigo called High Level. Tell us about the book. Give us the elevator pitch.
Basically, High Level is a post-apocalyptic sci-fi adventure story, and it moves the future of right now about a few hundred years after a lot of bad things have happened that if anyone's been paying attention, we're kind of careening towards right now. So instead of kind of telling the dystopian version of what happens next, this is about what happens when people have lost all their history and pieced together a new society from the scraps of the old world. Okay. And we follow a main character called 13, who's a kind of self-interested survivalist who lives on the outskirts of this world, and she gets sucked into a much larger adventure in a very kind of classic adventure story way, and we kind of get bigger and bigger and bigger as we unveil the world through her eyes.
Okay. Now you have history as an art director for a number of things, Nine Inch Nails being one of them. When you're working with an artist like Barnaby Bagenda, who's an amazing artist, how much input did you want to put on the visual side of the book, or were you happy to write it and let Barnaby bring his visual aesthetic to it?
I can't, as an art director, I just can't help myself, you know. So the script is about twice as long as the number of pages in the comic. I try to, like, obviously his style is super, super important, but I can't help but describe every panel in intense detail. But part of the reason for that is that we're trying to build a really dense world, and we don't want to get bogged down. We don't want to bog down the storytelling with explaining everything in the world. Mm-hmm. So Barnaby's incredible because he can take the general descriptions, and I can tell him what the backstory is and stuff, and then he can flesh it out in the margins. So the artwork is telling as much of the story, if not more so, than what's actually happening in the dialogue. And that, I couldn't have done it without someone like Barnaby, who is incredibly gifted at that, and he really builds convincing worlds. Uh-huh. So I had to, as an art director, I had to get my voice in there, but he does so much of the work for me. It's great.
Now, what is your history with comics? Is this your first comic?
This is my first comic.
So what is your history? Did you grow up reading comics? Is it something you came to later in life? What's your personal history?
I grew up reading comics. I discovered superhero comics when I was probably 8, 9 years old or whatever. And it's crazy because when I was I got really, really, really into comics. I had boxes and boxes and boxes of them. But when I was a teenager, I discovered Sandman, and that kind of changed my whole trajectory of the comics I was into, from superheroes into indie titles and darker stories. And Vertigo Comics was I know it sounds like something I would say, but it really I have proof. I have a picture of me in high school with the death poster on my wall. So this is like a dream come true to get to be involved in Vertigo, especially as my first comic. I couldn't picture anywhere else that'd be more of a dream to be at, because it really did. I mean, Sandman and all the Transmetropolitan and all those changed my life as a reader, and opened up my world to what stories could be told with comics. So
for this story, was it a story that came to you as a comic, or did you have this idea and then you debated, screenplay, novel, comic? Did this story initially jump out at you as a sequential art story?
Yeah, I'd kind of been drawing this character and the world for a while, because I like to draw as well, just for fun. And I had been drawing this character in a way that kind of made me think of it as this would be cool as an animated series or something like that. And I wanted to start to flesh it out into something, but I didn't really have, I'm not an animator. I wasn't sure where it was going to end up. But there was a story in there, and there were visuals attached to it. And it just so happened that's when DC approached me and said, would you be, we think you're an interesting type of person, with the work you've done in the past with Nine Inch Nails and Year Zero and everything, do you have any ideas for comic books? And I was like, I do, actually. But I think what had held me back in the past from making a comic book was that I felt like I needed to draw it myself. Right. Because I'm also an artist, but I'm a very slow artist. So one issue, comic book art is an incredibly skilled craft.
I don't know how they do it.
I don't either. I have no idea, because it would take me 2 years to make one issue probably if I had to draw it myself. So that was this stumbling block, because I thought of myself primarily as an artist, then a writer. And so when they came to me and said, they didn't ask me to draw the comic. They came and said, do you want to write a comic? And I was like, wow, I could have someone else do the art. Genius. So it all just happened to like perfectly come together at the right time.
Now, you mentioned the DC approached you about this. Had you been putting out feelers saying, hey guys, I want to do a comic, or was it just kind of happenstance that you wound up getting contacted by DC?
It was just happenstance. Actually, I'd been talking with Jim Lee in the past when I was with Nine Inch Nails. We were going to do a comic anthology of the Year Zero, and it never came together. And then that was when Jim was at Wildstorm, and we were going to do something there. And we talked to Grant Morrison about it, and Grant became a friend of mine. But that whole project kind of faded away, and then it was like, well, that was it. I'm not going to do a comic now. And it just so happened that the editor, one of the editors who moved to Vertigo from DC, was a fan of what we did with Year Zero, and was like, hey, let's see if this guy has more stories to tell. And then weirdly enough, it turned out that now Jim Lee's my publisher again.
Right.
So it all kind of came around full circle. But I'd kind of thought that the opportunity was gone, and then it came back around again.
Well, Year Zero was really interesting because, it obviously started as an album, but it became this whole multimedia experience, and there was a lot of like real life elements to it. Do you have any aspirations to take this comic and to bust it outside of the comic book pages, to do more of that sort of interactive type storytelling?
I would love to. We're going to have to be very creative in what we can do because we don't quite have the budget that we got for Year Zero.
Right.
Yeah, we spent the whole album's marketing budget on making that experience. But if there's any opportunity to do stuff like that, and actually, I don't know if we have one here. Do we have the poster here?
Can we get a poster? Here we go.
So we got to do this poster today, which is kind of like a cool thing where instead of just making a poster of the cover, they were like, what if you made something from the world of the comic?
Oh, wow. Let's show this to the camera
this
there.
This is an actual, so I designed this map. It's a map of the world, and it's made in-world by a character for a character.
Oh.
So we're, I have a huge interest in making artifacts and stuff that comes out of the pages of the comic book. So as many things like this that we can do, I want to do them.